PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors of books about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Philip Mosley about his book, Telling of the Anthracite, A Pennsylvania Post-History.
This week on PA Books, Philip Mosley, author of Telling of the Anthracite.
Philip Mosley is the author of Telling of the Anthracite, A Pennsylvania Post-History. What is post-history?
Well, post-history is the term that I came up with in order to describe the period that I'm concerned with in the book. Anthracite history is a long one. The history of the mining of anthracite coal in northeastern Pennsylvania. But my interest is in the period since King Coal was dethroned, and that's basically 60 odd years from about 1960 to the present day. And so in order to not to confuse my focus with that of many anthracite historians who have written extensively on the subject, I decided to call this, rather than another anthracite history, call it an anthracite post-history.
Now, professionally, your fields are the study of literature and cinema, as well as the practice of literary translation. How did that professional background shape how you approach this subject?
Well, two ways of answering that, Phil. One is that I've always been passionate about history. And when I was thinking about enrolling in college a long, long time ago, it was a little bit of a toss-up as to whether I would major in English or history. And I thought to myself, well, okay, if I major in English, I have several years of reading novels, poems, and plays. And I thought to myself, well, that's a no-brainer. So I opted for English, but I'd always been very interested in history, and I've retained that passion for history. But perhaps to answer your question more precisely, everything I've done in terms of writing and thinking about literature and cinema has always been very firmly done in an historical context. For me, the understanding of literature, the understanding of cinema, has always been a matter of having a full grasp of the history that surrounds those media, those arts.
Now, you also say that this book is a tribute to the region that you've made your home. When did you come into this region, and what was it that struck you about it?
Yeah, I've been here 35 years now. Came over in 1988, and I was living in Scotland at the time. And during the 80s, when I was living in Glasgow and teaching there, you may remember there was a very long and bitter miners' strike during the period of the Margaret Thatcher government. And the area where I was living, which is West Scotland, around Glasgow, was also traditionally a coal mining area. And I found myself getting drawn into the miners' strike, trying to understand more about miners, about their struggles, and about their communities. And then Penn State came in with a job offer, and so I took the decision to leave Scotland and come over here. And the job I was offered was at the Scranton campus of Penn State. And on arrival in northeastern Pennsylvania, almost the first thing I discovered was that this area too had a very rich mining history. And so it was almost a natural segue from my interest in mining that had grown in my years in Scotland to an interest in mining that continued once I got to this area. And it didn't take me long to understand that northeastern Pennsylvania was defined in a way by anthracite mining. There is no way in which one can understand its history, whether social, industrial, economic, cultural, without understanding the primary role of anthracite mining in that history. So it was kind of a natural progression for me to start exploring anthracite history in northeastern Pennsylvania. And I did so for some years, traveling around the region, finding out about things, visiting sites, reading books, and so on, until I'd accumulated enough material to try to publish something on the subject. And as you intimated, this was something that was not my professional field, but something that was always there, if you like, bubbling under anything I was doing professionally. And being a professor of literature, I thought that the first good way into this would be to try to publish something about anthracite that was basically also something to do with literature. And so I decided to put together an anthology of 6 Pennsylvania coal region plays, which I did in 2007. It was published by the sadly now defunct University of Scranton Press. And the book was called Anthracite, an anthology of coal region plays. And that was my first venture into writing and publishing on the subject. But my interest didn't stop there. And in the following years, I continued to build up a body of research material until I retired in 2017. And at that point, I thought to myself, well, one of the things I could do now that I'm retired and I'm really under no obligation to anybody to write specific profession-related things would be to write a history book. And so the idea came to me to try to put all my accumulated knowledge and material into a very personal book, a book that would not only be a contribution to anthracite historiography, but also be my way, as you had earlier touched upon, my way of paying a tribute to the area that I've made my home in for, as I say, 35 years now. So there was a very personal incentive, as well as an intellectual incentive, to try to go ahead and write this book. And the result is telling of the anthracite of Pennsylvania post-history.
Now, a big part of your approach is looking at the subject of this area, the anthracite culture and the people who live there and the landscape, and to think about things in 2 categories, modes of recall and representational forms. Can you explain what those different categories mean to you?
Yes, although I wrote this book aimed at the general reader, if you like, the common reader, if you like, it wasn't meant to be an academic and is not an academic book per se. I felt nonetheless that in order to give the book a certain kind of framework, a certain structure, I needed to introduce a set of terms, directional terms, if you like, that would help the reader understand what I'm writing about. And modes of recall was a phrase I came up with in order to cover those parts of telling the anthracite story in the post-historical period that would include material culture, whether that be, sites and other aspects of place, parts of the landscape, or whether that might be objects of various kinds, artifacts of various kinds, whether it might be signs that one might encounter moving around the area, even things like souvenir merchandise, which in its own way helps to tell that story. And modes of recall also was my framing term for the great amount of interpersonal activity that has helped continue to tell this story. And by that, I mean things like, obviously oral history goes under that category, but also associations, groups of people, festivals, gatherings, and even internet sites. So all of those I lumped under this term modes of recall. I reserved the term representational forms for the representation of the anthracite story in the various arts and media. And by that, I would include literature, obviously historiography, but also fiction, drama, and poetry. Performance arts, theatre, music, particularly, and cinema. Visual arts, photography, painting, drawing, printmaking, mixed media, sculpture, and again, of course, the cinema. And those allowed me to have, if you like, the material organized into separate chapters, but at the same time to yoke the two sets of categories together. And I did finish the book, as you will have seen, with a separate chapter on cinema. And the reason for that was that I've done so much work on cinema over the years that I'd accumulated rather more on that particular aspect than on some of the others. So I felt that it was justifiable and, if you like, merited to have a separate chapter afterwards, which I entitled Mine with a Movie Camera, a play, of course, on the famous Vertov documentary Man with a Movie Camera. And as a result of that, I felt I had something of a theoretical framework in order to organize the book.
Now, the Knox mine disaster happened in 1959, and after that, mines were closing. In this post-history that you're talking about, how long did it take from the period when the mines were active before people started commemorating and building museums and start thinking about it from a different perspective?
Yeah, I found out that in the period from 1960 through the early 1980s, there was very little that had been done. And this was very interesting to me because it seemed to correspond to the sense that I had got in talking to people and in reading, that there had been something of a collective amnesia in the region, born of the pain of the industry going and the subsequent depression on many levels that affected the mining communities of the region. And it also seemed to me that it takes time for an historical perspective to form on a particular phenomenon. And I think another reason why it took 20 years or so before this telling of the anthracite began to take off was that that perspective, in a way, didn't exist. The region and its inhabitants were still too close to King Coal and what had happened to it and what had happened to them. But by the early 1980s, telling of the anthracite in all its various forms really took off, and it's continued apace ever since.
Now, when the mines were active, the people's lives and communities are all shaped around that economic activity. But once they come to an end and people move on, then all of that becomes shaped through people's memories. And you talk about social memory and social forgetting. What did you find in terms of what people wanted to remember and what maybe they wanted to forget?
I found that what they most wanted to remember was the great pride in their communities, as they had been. They wanted to remember the courage of the miners. They wanted to remember the way in which mining communities practice the principle of looking after one another. Things of that nature, positive human qualities that no matter how hard times were, and at times they were, of course, desperately hard, those human qualities continued to shine. And I found that people wanted to remember that, wanted to remember a time also when the unions were strong, when miners fought for what they felt was their due. What they preferred to forget was the collapse of an industry that had provided a very large share of the workforce of northeastern Pennsylvania. They wanted to forget the pain of members of their family working in the mines, working long hours, working at times in very, very difficult conditions, succumbing to injuries, succumbing to fatal injuries in some cases, succumbing to disease like black lung, for example, in the aftermath of their occupations. So it was, predictably, I suppose, the positive human qualities that people wanted to remember and are still proud of. And it was the pain, the hardship, and in the post-historical period, the feeling of uncertainty, almost of despair at one time as to what would become of the region, where would people find work, how would they make ends meet, etc., etc. And another thing they wanted to forget, although it's still evident, less so than before, was the way in which the physical environment had been devastated by a century and more of anthracite mining.
Well, let's talk more about that physical environment, because landscape plays into this as well, where not only does the mining and the different structures and other elements of that are the product of mining shape the landscape, and then once time passes, what happens to that landscape and how does that become part of the way people remember things?
Yeah. In many places, that devastated landscape has been somewhat rehabilitated, has been, where there were mines, the sites have been cleaned up. There is very little left, in fact, on the ground of the anthracite industry. There is no one coal breaker left in the region, apart from a replica breaker that one may see at Eckley Miners Village, but that's not an authentic breaker. It was constructed in the late 60s for the shooting of the film The Molly Maguires. But the authentic breakers, which once were the structures that dominated the area because they were so fundamental to the way the industry operated, they have all gone. So you could argue that that's a great loss, because at least one, maybe more, might have been saved for historical purposes, for historical value. On the other hand, those structures and all the attendant colliery structures that covered the region at one time have largely disappeared. So there's been a chance there for the landscape to be remediated in various ways. What remains of that anthracite landscape largely now falls into two categories. The first is the continuing presence of strip mining pits, because what is left of the anthracite industry is almost entirely now surface mining, open pit mining. And there are certain parts of the old anthracite region, notably the old middle field, which runs from east of Hazleton, PA, out to beyond Shamokin, PA. There is still quite an active strip mining industry going on there. And of course, a strip mining pit is a stripping pit. There's no two ways about it. It's ugly, it's dirty, it's a great big gash and hole in the ground. So that remains. And also, there are still some of the culm banks remaining. Culm banks, of course, being the piles of waste material from the mines that once upon a time towered above most mining communities. A great many of them have been, have been remediated. They've been revegetated, grass has been sown, etc., etc. But some still remain. And you can still go to certain towns and find these culm banks many years after mining ceased, still looming above the community. A good example of that would be at Treverton, also in the middle field, west of Shamokin, where you drive through the small mining town, or former mining town, and still the culm bank towers over you as you approach the edge of town. So the landscape has changed dramatically since King Coal. It took a while to take off, and again, it was in the 1970s and into the 1980s that really the big cleanup process started. But you can still see things here and there dotted around the region. The other thing I should mention is it's hard to know how to put this really, is that coming along to replace coal more recently have been other kinds of industries. One of them is the waste industry. And there are areas still in the old mining region where you'll now see what I call the new coal banks, which are actually garbage mountains. And there's a certain degree of irony in seeing these tall structures that have almost taken the place of what once were the places where coal waste was put. It's a strange. There are many strange ironies in the post-history of anthracite.
Another part of the landscape aspect is how artists have approached it. And in the 1960s and 70s, different genres of art emerged, conceptual art and land art. How did artists working in those fields approach the landscape of this in this post-historical period?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And there are some interesting examples of that around the anthracite region. In the Scranton area, for example, there were a number of land art projects that took place in the 1970s and 80s. Sadly, these projects, large-scale landscape art, sadly, in many cases, they have not been properly maintained. And so they have suffered also some of the damage and depredations that were typical of the anthracite industry. Mural art is another area that's interesting, a form of public art, which can be seen by many, many people. And there are a number of murals that I've witnessed in my travels around the region, which help to tell the anthracite story, and they're very good. But occasionally one will find such a mural that has suffered damage over the years simply because it's very hard to maintain such a piece of art in pristine condition. And the same would go for land art and landscape art, where whole areas were designated an artistic site. It's very hard unless you have a lot of financial support and a lot of collective goodwill to keep those projects going.
Now, one of the concepts that you offer in the book is the idea of the industrial sublime, and that harkens back to Edmund Burke's ideas about the sublime. Can you talk a little bit about what Burke was thinking and how did that apply then to industrial sites?
Yes, back in the 18th century, Burke came up with this notion of the sublime to describe places that had some kind of romantic effect on the viewer, but that romantic effect was generated largely via fear, terror, awe, rather than just by the contemplation of a more passive beauty or pastoral peacefulness. And so the idea of the industrial sublime applied very well, I think, for example, to the coal breakers, because these are huge industrial structures that to many people could be quite daunting and quite menacing. And often they were accompanied with a lot of darkness from the coal, of course, and the coal banks close by and so on. But in a strange way, you could argue that in the aesthetics of the anthracite landscape, they had their own kind of beauty. And I think some of the painters in the 19th century and some of the artists in various media since then have understood that there is a certain kind of beauty in the anthracite landscape, and they've attempted to represent that in various ways.
Now, you also talk about how over time some of these relics went from industrial sublime to the industrial picturesque. What do you mean by that?
Well, that really refers to the idea that once the industry was no longer active, that sense of power, which was fundamental to Burke's conception of the sublime, whether it was a waterfall, a natural thing like a waterfall or a volcano, what characterized that industrial sublime was the sheer power and force. In the post-historical period, of course, that power and that force no longer applies because the industry is no longer operating. So the wheels are no longer turning, so to speak. So what remained moved into a category more of the picturesque, that it became more something that one would contemplate, if you like, in a gentler way, in a more measured way.
Now, another part of how you're approaching this is to look at things like social history and the miners themselves and the lives that they lived. Can you talk about the ethnicities of some of the miners during the period when the mines were active and how those identities continue to shape the region?
Yes. When anthracite mining started in northeastern Pennsylvania, the earliest immigrants who had the know-how to get it underway were largely English, German, Welsh, Scots. And once the industry was established, and we're talking the 19th century, early to mid 19th century, there became, as the industry grew very fast, there became a need for a huge pool of labor to be brought in to do the grunt work in the mines. And tragically, I suppose, that need coincided, and again, maybe ironically, that need coincided with the Great Famine in Ireland. And so many Irish came to the area to work in the mines, and they were fleeing, of course, terrible conditions back home in Ireland. And they came here in the expectation and the hope that they would find a better life here. To some degree they did. They escaped starvation, but they came and formed the backbone of the labor force of the anthracite industry. And it was for the most part, a very hard life. But, the totem pole principle works in anthracite as it does in most industries. And bit by bit, as the pioneers had moved up in the hierarchy, the Irish began to move up in the hierarchy too, but there was still a tremendous need. I mean, we're talking the turn of the 20th century now, anthracite the industry still going full pelt at that point. New immigrant labor was required, and that's when you began to see the influx of the Italians, in great numbers, followed by people of various Slavic identities, Poles, Slovakians, then also subsequently Lithuanians. And bit by bit, you found that the region, socially speaking, was a tapestry of very different ethnicities, most of whom had established themselves in northeastern Pennsylvania in order to be part of the anthracite industry.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
So with all these different groups in the coal country, did the experience of working in the mines create a common identity?
Yes and no. It created a common identity insofar as this was the labor force, and very often they were up against their employers, whoever they may have been, and so had to find ways to band together. Unions, of course, were one way of doing this. So there was a sense of coal miners all united, if you like, to try to counter exploitation by the mine owners. But the other side of that coin is that these ethnicities were very distinct, and often they carried with them, of course, not only different languages, but different religions or different persuasions of Christianity. And And they also carried with them very different customs. So you would find that often there were internecine rivalries taking place within the coal communities, and that depending on what your background was, you could find yourself up against someone or a group of people belonging to another ethnicity. And this might take place in the same small town. So you might conceivably have a small mining town where pretty much everyone in the town was employed in the mining industry, but where, almost like a cake, you could maybe cut the town up into 4 or 5 sections, which would almost be laws and enclaves unto themselves. So it's interesting. Yes, there was unity. I don't think the miners could have achieved what they could in terms of claiming their rights and improving their conditions without unity. And largely, as I say, that came through unionization. But no, there was a tradition, if you like, of rivalry, and sometimes very bitter rivalry, occasionally downright hatred of mining communities where other ethnicities were in the majority.
Now, with these different immigrant groups coming into that region, they often would bring things like their music from the countries of origin. How did they adapt their music and make songs that fit into the coal culture?
There was a very strong oral tradition, of course, a sort of troubadour tradition. This was in the days, of course, before recorded music and before radio, before television, before any of that. And there was a tradition of wandering bards who were often miners themselves, but who had either brought the songs over with them from the old country or had learned them through their particular communities. And they would travel around from mine patch to mine patch, town to town, sharing these songs, performing them, and keeping that tradition of song alive. When recorded music became possible in the early 20th century and radio came in, and subsequently other modern media, then of course there was a means whereby these musical traditions could be preserved, because they could be recorded on tape and subsequently released on records or played on radio programs or what have you. So the musical tradition is a very strong one, but it almost vanished because once the oral tradition, once these modern media came into being, and again we're talking early 20th century, the old oral traditions began to decline. And there was a time when it was feared that the tradition might be lost. And one very important figure in keeping this going was George Corson, very famous musicologist, who did more than anyone else really to document and subsequently to go into the mines and record miners singing these songs. And I think without George Corson's work, the later revival of mining related folk music that happened from the 1960s onwards might not have happened in northeastern Pennsylvania. Happily it did, and there have been solo artists, singer-songwriters, but also folk groups in the region from the 1960s onwards who have managed to keep that coal mining music tradition alive. So
part of the post-history era is the development of museums. There's the Anthracite Heritage Museum and others. When did they first start coming in? When were they started to be developed, and how did they shape the memory of the period of anthracite mining?
They began to be developed in the late 60s, and most really came into being in the 1970s, really got going in the 1970s. And that offered a strong lead, I think, to the drive to rethink anthracite history, to remember it, and to preserve it. I think the importance of these institutions is that they gave a public presence to anthracite history in the post-historical period. In other words, it wasn't left only to well-meaning individuals in communities or individual artists to do this, but there was a sense that at a public level, at a governmental level, if you wish, there was now a will to keep this history alive, and to do it through the construction and operation of specific sites that would become attractive to tourists, visitors, and of course to be a draw to residents of the region themselves, so they could find places where they could go and be reminded of the history that they carried deep within themselves. And in the Anthracite region, there are really three major examples of that. The Anthracite Heritage Museum in Scranton, which is in the old northern anthracite field, the Museum of Anthracite Mining in Ashland, which is in the old western middle anthracite field. That museum focused largely on tools and instruments related to the industry. The Anthracite Heritage Museum has that also, but also is very, very, very much concerned with the social history of coal mining too. And the third site that was constructed as part of this drive that emanated at state level and has been organized and run by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museums Commission was the miners' village at Eckley in the old eastern middle anthracite field. Eckley Miners' Village is an example of living history in action. It's an old patch town in that particular part of the middle field that was reclaimed and turned into a living history. So not only is there a visitor center and a museum space, but most importantly, the old village houses remain, and visitors may go into these houses, may walk the old street, and almost get a sense of what it was like living in an anthracite patch town in the heyday of anthracite mining. And as I mentioned earlier on, it's also at Eckley where one can see a replica coal breaker, the one that was put up there in the 60s in order to facilitate the filming of probably the best known movie about the anthracite region, The Molly Maguires, which was released in 1969 and starred Sean Connery and Richard Harris. So it was a full-on Hollywood production with big star names to go with it.
Can you talk a little bit about the Centralia mine fire and how that seems to have captured the imagination of people, not just in the United States, but around the world? You mentioned the Japanese horror survival series, Silent Hill. How have creators in different genres captured the Centralia mine fire?
Earlier, you had mentioned the Knox mine disaster as one of something that I tried to organize the book around. In connection with that notion of post-history, I had decided that really 1960 would be my starting point. And I chose that time because 1960 was the year that came right between the Knox mine disaster, 1959, and the beginning of the Centralia mine fire, which began in 1962, and by the way, is still burning today. And those two cataclysmic events seem to me to mark the end of anthracite, and the end of anthracite history, if you like, and the beginning of the post-history. And as far as the Centralia mine fire goes, it caught my imagination, as it has done many others, because it is the classic example of what was once a thriving anthracite mining town, having become almost completely depopulated and almost completely wiped out physically as a result of the fire. Many of your viewers will perhaps know the story, but basically the government relocated nearly the entire population to other places because of the danger posed by the fire. And it was a fire that in the 1980s broke into the national headlines because there were various accidents that took place related to it. And for a while, there was a national feeding frenzy among the media on the Centralia mine fire. But once that had died down, the fascination with Centralia as a strange and highly symbolic site continued. And as you mentioned, artists of various kinds, writers, photographers, musicians, filmmakers, have continued to feed off the unusual nature of this place. It's a ghost town, basically, and it carries with it, of course, all those suggestions of the supernatural, of the bizarre, of the macabre. And while some of that interest has been prurient, to put it mildly, some other parts of that interest in Centralia have resulted in very interesting cultural products of one sort or another.
How has documentary film been used to explore the Anthracite culture and how we remember it?
At one point in the book, I argue that photography is probably the Anthracite history medium. And so because of its sheer ability to document on a vast scale the history of anthracite. If you take a step forward and go into the era of motion picture photography, i.e. cinema, then of course that power of documentation has continued. And I think that's one reason why documentary film is by far, I think, the most important part of cinema to have captured the anthracite story. And in the post-historical period, many great documentaries have continued to be made about Knox, about Centralia, and about various other aspects of the anthracite region. There are relatively few feature films. I mentioned the Molly Maguires. There was also Barbara Loden's film Wander in 1970, which has become something of a cult movie, and one or two others. But by and large, narrative fiction film has not played a particularly important part in telling the anthracite story. Documentary film has, because I think it not only has that ability to use footage that allows you to see what the landscape looks like now, but also what it looked like before by means of using still images, etc. But also it's permitted that social commentary and even political commentary on anthracite history to enter into the film. So depending on the stance of the filmmaker and the approach taken, the narrative of the film may well confront many of the social, political, and even moral, ethical issues presented to us by the history of the industry and by the problems of the that have arisen during the aftermath of the industry. In other words, the long period of despair, anxiety, and depression on various levels that followed the collapse of King Coal.
Now, another artistic medium that is in the region is that of memorial sculptures. And here you have works of public art that serve to commemorate, but they also have an aesthetic value as well. If people are going through the region and discovering these, what types of experiences do those provide?
Well, again, as I mentioned earlier in connection with mural art, one of the great things about memorials and monuments and public sculptures of various kinds is that they make the history available to many people, because if you come upon a statue, shall we say, at the end of a main street, on a main road, many people are going to see it. So it's a highly accessible form of anthracite post-history. I think people are going to be reminded when they see these monuments, they're going to be reminded again of the pride of the miner. Many of these monuments will show miners at work in characteristic poses, characteristic postures, with characteristic expressions. And that can be very moving and very powerful on an emotional level, but also aesthetically very moving too. Can also be a very unnerving experience, and a good example of that would be the Molly Maguire Historical Park in Mahanoy City, which is in the western section of the old Middle Anthracite field. And there you will find a very simple, stark, environment on a street in the town where the noted sculptor Zenos Fridakis, who actually has the moniker the Monument Man because he's quite famous for his public art, has sculpted in bronze one of the Molly Maguires, the renegade group of Irish miners from the late 19th century, has sculpted one of the Molly Maguires dressed in green civilian clothes, hooded and about to be hung. Because if one knows the story of the Molly Maguires, a good 20 of them or so were executed as a result of the uprising against the mine companies in the 1870s. And if you go to see the Molly Maguire Historical Park, you see something that is very meaningful, you see something that is very important, but it's also something that can take the viewer aback, because it's not a comfortable place to be. It's a sculpture, it's a piece of public art that really makes you stop and think, and has great aesthetic value. Fridakis's work is outstandingly good, but it's also a little bit scary, I suppose. And certainly the place, the little area where the sculpture is found is quite disturbing. So I think public sculpture, monuments, which one can find dotted across the Anthracite region, do play a very important part in the post-history, in the telling of the story. And they can reinforce the values of the mining communities, the pride, the dignity, the upstanding physical nature of the miner and all that. And that's very important. But also some of these sculptures can remind us of the tragedies of the unjustified treatment of many people from the mining communities over the years.
Now, one of the concepts that you reference in the book is Paul Crutzen's idea of the Anthropocene. Can you explain what that is and how that applies to the post-history of this region in terms of the environmental effects?
Yes, well, the Anthropocene, which is a almost overdone concept now, that Paul Crutzen came up with, refers to the period of time in which man's impact upon the environment has been the dominant impact. And it's important, I think it's relevant to the post-history of anthracite, because it takes us back to something we discussed a little earlier, which was the way in which the landscape in the last 60 years has been reshaped and remade for present-day purposes. And there is not only the fact that the surface mining sites remain, but there is also the coal banks, and as I mentioned, the mountains of garbage, and so on and so forth. And so in a way, I think whenever we think now about the impact of fossil fuels on our world, which is something that's directly attributed to the period of the Anthropocene, we have to think about the role that coal played in it and the way in which vestiges of that impact upon the environment remain in the area, or ways in which they've been changed, but where they are still showing signs of other industries, other human activities that have left a particular mark upon the landscape.
One of the things you mentioned in the book is you say that industrial landscapes and their architecture have intrigued me from an early age. What drew you to those at an early age?
I was born in the fishing port of Grimsby in England, which is on the Humber River, on the east coast of England, on the North Sea coast. And as a child, my father would sometimes take me down to the docks, and Grimsby was, in its heyday, was one of the largest fishing ports in the world, a trawling industry for deep sea, North Sea fish. And when I was only 4 or 5, I would be astounded by the sight of the docks, not only the ships themselves, but the warehouses and the huge cranes that stretch seemingly to a small boy's mind for miles and miles along the banks of the Humber River. And so there was a fascination with industrial architecture and the industrial environment that was instilled in me very early. And my grandparents were from Sheffield, which was a great steel city, known, I suppose, to Americans as the Pittsburgh of England, just as Pittsburgh might be known as the Sheffield of, of the United States. And I spent a lot of time as a child at my grandparents' place, and so I was exposed also in Sheffield to the almost overpowering might of the Sheffield steel industry. The foundries, the mills, the smokestacks, the whole 9 yards. And so by the time I was 7 or 8, industrial architecture was really very, very deeply ensconced in my consciousness, and I remained interested and taken by it thereafter. And even today, I remain awed, in the very best sense of the word, by examples of that industrial architecture, whatever industry may be in question.
Now, this industrial architecture has inspired a lot of artists, from photographers to painters. One painter from that region, Franz Klein, is known for, of course, for his abstract art. Do you see the influence of that industrial architecture in his abstract art?
Oh, absolutely. I think Klein is one of the most important of anthracite artists. I tend not to, I don't give him a lot of space in the book because he's not a post-historical anthracite artist. He's from the anthracite historical period, but his influence on anthracite art that has come along in the period since is immense. And I think in his abstract canvases, one sees, though in very powerful form, one sees those forms and those shapes of the buildings and the structures that he knew so well growing up as a child in the region. So yes, very much so.
Now, you'd mentioned before photography and how important that was, especially since it developed in line with the development of the anthracite culture itself. You talk in the book about the New Deal and programs like the Farm Security Administration's historical projects, where they sent photographers into the region. What were they doing, and what influence did they have on later photographers?
Again, I think they had a great deal of influence. In the 40s particularly, and during wartime, the FSA decided that it would be very important to send photographers in to the anthracite region to document the war effort as it was taking place around the anthracite industry. And so various photographers came into the region and did some very interesting work. And I think the influence of those photographers from basically from the 1940s can be seen in the post-historical work of quite a few of the younger photographers who have come along in the period since. There is one photographer in particular, George Harven, who was a native of the anthracite region, who straddles both the historical period and the post-historical period. So he's particularly important in terms of a continuity that has been established between the official photographers of the 1930s and 40s and the photographers of the post-historical period. He grew up in Lansford in the Panther Valley. He was part of a mining community himself. He was most of his buddies were miners, and he decided to devote his entire career to being a photographer based in the anthracite region and shooting much of his work in the area he knew best. The Panther Valley, which is at the easternmost point of the old southern anthracite field. And we're talking, most viewers will know where Jim Thorpe is, talking the area that stretches westward from Jim Thorpe, PA, to Pottsville. That's essentially the Panther Valley, the old Panther Valley mining period. And George Harven grew up there and did most of his work there. His work was so good that I think he could have made it nationally if he had so been inclined. But he decided to stay close to home and left us with a body of really remarkable photographs of the Anthracite period and the industry in action. He is also particularly important because he documented an attempt in the post-historical period by a small group of former deep coal miners to get the industry going again on a limited scale. Most of the people working in the Panther, most of the miners working in the Panther Valley had worked for the giant Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company, who dominated the mining industry in the Panther Valley. And most of their deep mines had closed in the 1960s. And a group of miners in the early around that time decided that they would try and set up an independent collective company that would do deep mining. And a small group of them began to refashion sections of the old number 9 mine of the LH&N in Lansford, Pennsylvania. And they kept this independent operation, deep mining of coal, going until 1972, when the odds were finally stacked up too greatly against them, and they had to end it. And Harven documented all of this. And so in 1970, in one of his most famous pictures, 1972, called Last Car of Coal, you see one of his friends. He was very intimate with these fellows. He knew them all very well. One of his friends, with a broad smile on his face, full of pride and dignity and good humor, but at the same time captured on an extremely sad day when this independent venture by former LH&N deep coal miners came to an end. And you see him riding on top of a coal car being pulled out of the mines, and Harven captured that moment in Last Car of Coal. Now, Harven's by no means the only photographer. As I said, he straddles the pre-1960 period in his work, because he was a company photographer for the LH&N, the LC&N in the 1950s. And then, of course, when he left their employ and became an independent photographer, he continued to shoot in the region well into the post-historical period until his own death in the subsequent years. But in the post-historical period itself, some very, very interesting photography is being done by a variety of artists, many of whom have personal connections to the region. They may no longer live in the region, but they either originated in the region or have still very strong family connections across the region. People like Joseph Elliott, for example, Ray Klimek. These are gentlemen who were from the Anthracite region and now live elsewhere. And in fact, Elliott's work, he started off doing anthracite photography, documenting mines and mining landscapes for the Library of Congress HAER project, Historic Architecture and Engineering project in the 1960s. And I was fortunate enough to be able to use one of Elliott's fine photographs on the cover of the book, an image that shows the old St. Nicholas breaker near Shenandoah in the middle field, which sadly is no longer there.
Well, we've been speaking with Philip Mosley. He is the author of Telling of the Anthracite, a Pennsylvania Post history. Philip, thank you for joining me.
It's been my pleasure, Phil. Thank you very much.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.